Now, understand there are 7 classes of fats in our diet. 7. And some of them will save your life, and some of them will kill you. Okay? There's a big spectrum all the way from one end to the other. Let's take them in order so that people can understand what they are and how they work, and where do you find them. So the most important and the most valuable fatty acid is omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3s are heart healthy, they're anti-inflammatory, they're anti-Alzheimer's, because they contribute to neuronal structure and function. And it has been shown that when you are omega-3 deficient, you get multiple diseases, including cardiovascular disease and depression. And omega-3s are very sparse in our diet. We don't get enough. And the question is, where do you get omega-3s from? Well, there are 2 places you can get omega-3s from. Okay. You can get them from vegetables. So vegans can get one kind of omega-3. There are 3. They can get one kind. They can get one called alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA. And ALA is good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's a good thing. It is anti-inflammatory. And so it actually affords cardiovascular protection. And that is good. However, the other 2 omega-3s, one is called EPA, or eicosapentaenoic acid, which is necessary for neural transmission. And the third one is called DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which is necessary for neuronal structure and membrane stability. Those only come from marine life. They only come from fish. Now, do the fish make omega-3s? No. The fish eat the omega-3s. So what makes the omega-3s? Algae. Algae make the omega-3s. The fish eat the algae. We eat the fish. We are getting our omega-3s third hand. Now, vegans don't eat fish. So the question is, how are vegans going to get the EPA and the DHA? And they need the EPA and the DHA because the conversion of ALA, which they do get, to EPA and DHA, which they don't get, is extremely poor. ALA almost doesn't get converted to EPA and DHA. And you need EPA and DHA. So I worry about vegans. So they need to supplement. Vegans need to supplement. And the question is, will they supplement? Because fish oil still comes from fish. And so that's a problem. And not only that, but you have to take fish oil capsules from fish that ate algae. Well, that means wild fish, because farm fish don't eat algae. Farm fish eat corn. And corn is filled with omega-6s. And we're going to get to that at the end. Remember, we said there are 7 classes. That's number 6. That's like on the worst side. All right? So omega-3s are super important. They contribute to mitochondria. They contribute to neuronal membrane stability. They contribute to suppression of inflammation, cardiovascular stability. There are a whole host of things that omega-3s do for you that are positive, that are in your best interest in terms of health. And we don't get enough. Number 2, monounsaturated fatty acids. Oleic acid, found in olive oil. Now, this is a very good fatty acid. And the reason it's very good fatty acid is because it is the endogenous ligand. Oleic acid is the endogenous ligand for a receptor in your liver called PPAR alpha, peroxisome proliferation activated receptor alpha. And this is the fuel gauge on the liver cell, basically telling the liver to work more efficiently and work better. And so it has a lot to do with energy dynamics. And so when you are low in PPAR alpha, you don't burn energy as well. It has an effect on mitochondria. So olive oil is a good a good fatty acid. The only problem with olive oil is that the bond, the double bond that caused it to be monounsaturated, because that's what we referred to when we were talking about unsaturated, is the double bonds in the fatty acid, which is a long chain of carbons. Okay, there are two kinds of fatty acids. There's cis fatty acids and there are trans fatty acids. You want cis fatty acids. And the reason is because we don't have the enzyme to break a trans double bond. Olive oil is cis fatty acid. That's good. But if you heat an olive oil, if you heat oleic acid past its smoking point, which is relatively low for olive oil, 310 degrees Fahrenheit, 165 degrees centigrade, okay, which is easy to do in a saute pan. What you do is you put enough heat across, enough energy across that double bond that it will actually flip. And now you have created a trans fatty acid right in your skillet. And that is poison. We're going to get to that as number 7. So you got to be careful about olive oil. Olive oil is meant to be consumed at room temperature. Number 3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. So polyunsaturated fatty acids are also good. They are good for several reasons. They are good because they are anti-inflammatory, but they also can flip their double bonds, and there are more double bonds to flip. The good news is most of the polyunsaturated fatty acids have a higher smoking point, so it's a little harder to make that trans fat switch. That's true. But it's also been shown that if you consume too many polyunsaturated fatty acids, you're going to end up with immune problems with your immune system. Number 4, saturated fatty acids. Now, everyone thinks saturated fatty acids are the devil incarnate. They think that is the worst of all the fatty acids. And the reason they think that is because that's what we were told for 45 years. That's what, Ansel Keys told us back in the 1960s and 70s. Saturated fat was evil, okay, and why we all needed to go low fat because saturated fat was bad for you. In addition, because saturated fat is animal fat, okay, comes from, lard and from pigs and from cows, and saturated fat, if you get rid of saturated fat, that means you're getting rid of the cows and the pigs and the goats and everything. And the vegans would like that very much. So there's sort of a feed-forward problem there. Turns out saturated fat is not one saturated fat. There are 2. There's even-chain saturated fatty acids, which are what's in red meat. And then there are odd-chain saturated fatty acids, which are what's in dairy. Turns out the odd-chain saturated fatty acids are metabolized differently than the even-chain. And also the odd-chain saturated fatty acids have a different phospholipid signature. They have a tail on the end, which makes them polar, which makes them actually do very different things in the body because they can basically bind to other things and activate other things. That phospholipid is very important. And it turns out that phospholipid signature is anti-inflammatory. So it turns out the dairy saturated fat is actually anti-inflammatory, whereas red meat saturated fat is not. But it's not pro-inflammatory either. In converse to what Ansel Keys told us. So saturated fat, neither good nor bad from that standpoint. And dairy saturated fat, actually good. Number 5, medium chain triglycerides. So these are very short triglycerides, usually on the order of about 10 to 14 carbons long, whereas a standard fatty acid would be 16 to 20 or 22 even carbons long. So 10 to 14 carbons. Turns out these are metabolized differently. They are absorbed differently. They are not absorbed in my cells and go through the lacteals and the lymphatic system. They end up going straight to the liver. Now, lots of people are excited about medium chain triglycerides because they're relatively high in coconut oil. And coconut oil is on every paleo and every vegan, menu as being a primary fat to cook in, and there may be some value to that. But the problem is that when your liver is presented with both saturated fat and medium-chain triglycerides, you're basically overwhelming your mitochondria's ability to oxidize. And so you can end up laying down more liver fat, and that can be a problem too. So, Medium chain triglycerides are sort of a good news, bad news deal depending on what else you're eating. Number 6, omega-6 fatty acids. Now, omega-6 fatty acids are what are found in seed oils, so soybean oil, etc. They are pro-inflammatory. Okay, omega-6s are the precursors, so like linoleic acid is omega-6. Remember, the other one's alpha-linolenic acid, ALA. This is linoleic acid, LA. They are not the same. They are very different. Okay, one's omega-3, the other one's omega-6. They sound the same, but they're not. They are the precursors of arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is the precursor to all of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, thromboxanes, eicosanoids, leukotrienes. Okay, all things that generate inflammation. Now, you need inflammation, otherwise you'd be eaten by the maggots. You need inflammation to be able to clear an infection. Okay, so in an acute situation, omega-6s are good because they will help you get rid of, whatever is trying to invade your body. But you certainly don't want that inflammation to be going on willy-nilly without an acute stimulus. And the problem is the more omega-6s, the more chronic inflammation. And that's bad for you every which way. And, will ultimately lead to early demise. So keeping the omega-6 levels down is wise. And omega-6s basically have taken over our entire diet. We talk about the need for an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 3-to-1. Optimally, it should be 1-to-1, but we can do with 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 and still be reasonably healthy. The problem is our current ratio in America is somewhere between 20 and 25-to-1. Way too many omega-6s, way too few omega-3s. So we need to boost those omega-3s and try to bring down the omega-6s. Now, bringing down the omega-6s is a little bit controversial. Like, for instance, Dariush Mozaffarian thinks we don't need to do that. We do need to raise the omega-3s. He thinks that's enough. I'm not so convinced. I think we do need to get those omega-6s down. And then finally, number 7, the devil incarnate, trans fats. And lots have been written about that. And, the very first trans fat was synthesized in 1902. Crisco was the first one that was patented in 1911. By 1920, they had appeared in virtually all baked goods in America. They are the reason for the 10-year-old Twinkie. And the reason is because bacteria can't digest the trans fats because they can't break the trans double bond. Well, guess what? Our mitochondria are refurbished bacteria. We don't have that enzyme either. We can't cleave that trans double bond either. So basically, a trans fat sits in your liver, never comes out, ultimately leads to fatty liver, cardiovascular disease, basically, it's basically like consuming poison because you can't get rid of it. So there are your 7 fats. And we are getting way too many of the wrong ones and not nearly enough of the right ones. And because of that, we are experiencing mitochondrial dysfunction just on that basis alone.
That's a great overview. And I got a lot of nuance I want to get into within that, starting with the trans fat piece. The way I understand it, trans fats have been at least largely banned in the food supply. We did talk about how if we're cooking with certain oils, we can create them within our own kitchen. How much of a concern are they within the food supply these days in the U.S.?
Well, the good news is that the FDA finally woke up. It took them a long time to wake up. It took a long time to ultimately do something about trans fats. And the reason was because the food industry was pushing, lobbying nonstop for them. And the answer to that is because if you put trans fats in the food, no depreciation. You can increase that sell-by date, to 3 years later, like those Hostess cupcakes, take a look at the sell-by date, they're still good, right? They're not good. They're never good, but they're at least they're consumable. In 1957, the first paper on the toxicity of trans fats was published by a guy at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana by the name of Dr. Fred Kumerow. And he is a hero in this story, and he is a hero to me. And he died not too long ago, maybe about 2 years ago, at age 101 or something like that. Probably because he never ate a trans fat, by the way. But he wrote about this in 1957, and basically it got lost. No one paid any attention to it. No one understood what was going on here. It didn't get resurrected again until 1988 when somebody else started working on it. And then Kumerow basically was still around, and he contributed greatly at that point because he knew and other people started to know. But it took the FDA 25 years, from 1988 till 2006, before they would do anything. And the first thing they did was they said, all right, let's put the number of trans fats on the nutrition facts label. And then finally in 2013, so 25 years after, they reappeared in 1988, 25 years later, finally the FDA agreed that they needed to be banned from ultra-processed foods. So they are disappearing. And, for the most part, trans fats have disappeared from the American food supply, which is good.
Are they still able to sneak in a small amount if it falls below a certain limit, or how does that work?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So on the label, they are allowed to say that if they have 0.49 grams of trans fat per serving, they can call 0.490. They round down. They should not be allowed to round down, but the FDA allows them to round down. So if you eat 4 Hostess cupcakes, you have gotten enough trans fat to kill you, because you have gotten basically 2 grams of trans fat, and you were told you got 0. So yes, they lie with numbers.
Okay. So given the fact they lie with numbers and they can still be a problem in the food supply, for somebody that is tuning into this and they're going to ditch ultra-processed foods, are there any other sources? Or if somebody's eating real food, are they going to be clear of that? I'm assuming it's just something from processing, so people should be fine if they avoid those.
Well, milk has very little natural trans fat. You can measure it in milk. Okay, so, some saturated fat will be trans fat, but it is exceedingly small and, for the most part, not to be worried about if it's real food. Really, trans fat is a synthetic phenomenon that the food industry puts in specifically to increase shelf life. So I think that we can ignore the inherent trans fat in real food and focus on just what the industry does to, sell their products. And that's what the FDA is worried about.
Let's stick on that milk piece, because this is a really important, interesting fact about saturated fat that not a lot of people are talking about. The fact that there's 2 different kinds, and you mentioned in red meat there's a type that's basically neutral. Within milk or dairy, there's the saturated fat that has possibly even a little bit of a benefit because it's anti-inflammatory.
Potentially, yes.
Is that just in cow dairy? And is there enough of a anti-inflammatory effect in there, in that special property, that it's worth people consuming to get that, or it's just there for,
Yep.
Is there enough pro to consume dairy is what I'm getting at.
Is there a good reason to drink milk? That's what you're asking. All right. So the answer to that is, I believe the answer to that is yes. Now, this is a little complicated. Milk generates an enormous amount of visceral reaction. So let me unpack it. Let me take it apart for you. There are some people who are intolerant to lactose. Okay, full stop, stay away from it. There are some people who are intolerant to certain milk proteins and develop a, milk protein allergy. Stay away from it, okay? You will know, because if you consume milk and you end up having enormous GI side effects, okay, that's probably a problem, okay? If that's true, what you should try to do is you should try to take some lactate, so, lactase as a supplement, and see whether or not you still have it. And if you still do, just stay away from it. That is probably, those two things, lactose intolerance and milk protein allergy, is probably about 20% of the population. So, not insignificant. There are a lot of people. African Americans have a significant increased risk of lactose intolerance. Jews have an increased risk of lactose intolerance. But that can be mitigated by taking lactase by mouth. By the way, I do. That's how I consume dairy, is with lactate, okay? Because I'm Jewish. The way it is. Okay, now the rest. What about the rest of us? Is there something in milk that's worthwhile? Number one, there's lots of amino acids, and that's good. Number two, there's lots of fatty acids, including some essential fatty acids. So that's good. Number three, there's a lot of calcium. Now, here's the problem with the calcium story. Everyone says you need calcium. You do. You absolutely do. No question. Calcium for bones, calcium for muscle functioning. Calcium is, calcium for hormone release. Okay, calcium is essential. And milk is a very good source of calcium. So you would say, well, then you should drink milk because of the calcium. And we tell postmenopausal women to drink milk because of the calcium, right? We give them vitamin D too, right? Wrong. This is the mistake. And the reason is not because there's not calcium, there is, but because there's way more phosphorus in milk. In order to absorb calcium, you have to have a calcium phosphate product that is conducive to absorption. And the problem is that the phosphate binds the calcium. So it becomes calcium phosphate or calcium biphosphate or diphosphate and makes it unavailable for absorption. So in other words, in order to absorb calcium, you have to have calcium without phosphate. And that's not milk. That's other foods, but it's not milk. So in fact, the calcium that's in milk is, for the most part, unabsorbable. And that's one of the reasons why giving milk to people with osteoporosis doesn't seem to benefit them. In fact, might even hurt them. Now, can you give calcium pills? Yes, you can give calcium pills, but does that fix osteoporosis? No, that doesn't fix osteoporosis either. And the reason is because the calcium just gets absorbed and goes right through you, does not end up in the bone. You have to do some things to the bone in order to get that calcium into the bone. And unfortunately, vitamin D is not the answer to that. That's why all of these trials of calcium and vitamin D in postmenopausal women have failed. So the notion that you can actually reverse osteoporosis by drinking milk, which is, of course, this, common urban myth that's out there, does not work. As a pediatric endocrinologist, I used to take care of multiple children with hypocalcemia, low serum calcium levels. And these kids are sick. They have the George syndrome or congenital hypoparathyroidism or autoimmune hypoparathyroidism or, host of different diseases leading to hypocalcemia. And we had to boost these kids' serum calcium levels to keep them from having seizures and tetany and, and stopping of the heart and what have you. Okay. This is a big deal. In order to do that, we had to give them calcium and we had to make sure that the calcium was absorbed. So we actually had to take away the milk. We had to take away dairy. We had to give the calcium with no phosphorus. We had to increase the calcium to phosphate product in whatever they were eating to 4 to 1, 4 calciums to 1 phosphorus, whereas milk is 1 to 2, 1 calcium to 2 phosphoruses. So we actually had to take away the milk and give them calcium without phosphorus. We had to give them calcium supplementation in the form of calcium gluconate or calcium chloride or something else, very specifically to increase the absorption. So this notion that milk is important because it has calcium is actually not correct. In addition, milk does not have vitamin D in it until or unless you irradiate it. So standard store-bought milk will be irradiated, and that's how it has high vitamin D. So you can buy unvitamin D milk, if you buy it from a local farmer or whatever, but that is not a good method for supplementing your vitamin D. So there are all sorts of issues with respect to milk. And then finally, let me address one last myth about milk, and that is that it causes cancer. And this all came from one book, and that book is called The China Study, written by Campbell and Esselstyn. And what they did was they looked at the population of China, and they did an epidemiologic analysis. 500 pages of single univariate correlations, and snapshot in time, no time component in the analysis. And what they came up with was that the consumption of dairy correlated with increased incidence of cancer. And so they said, therefore, milk causes cancer. And they said that casein, the protein in milk, the primary protein in milk, was the bad guy. Number one, this is not how you determine causation. Univariate correlations are not the same as multivariate correlations, and multivariate correlations are not the same as causation. In order to determine this, you would have to have a time component, which they do not have. Okay, and also, there's this thing called reverse causation, where it might be actually people with cancer might have, altered, food intake, and it might also be that there's intermediate causation. Something else is causing both of those things that has nothing to do. Like, for instance, ice cream consumption correlates with drownings. Is it that ice cream causes drownings? Or is it that survivors of drownings, bury their heads in a banana split? Well, neither, okay? Ice cream usually is consumed when it's hot outside. People swim when it's hot outside, and some people who swim drown. Okay, so yes, ice cream consumption is correlated with drownings, having nothing to do with any causation linking those two things directly. Rather, there's an antecedent that leads to both of those separately. That's called an epiphenomenon. So it very well may be that, what they were studying in China was an epiphenomenon, not a primary causative phenomenon. There's no data that suggests that drinking milk increases the risk for cancer.
Let's stick on the China study here for a little bit. That book seems to have a lot of legs and continues to get brought up time and time again. And the reason I want to stick with it, is there any data that they gained from that study that we can use? Or because of the variables that you talked about there and the way it was done, there's only associations made and there's nothing we can really take from it?
There's only association. And, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo in nutrition based on association. And nutrition has been derided by multiple scientists as being basically the dark arts of medicine. And to be honest with you, if you use it wrong, they're right. They're correct. John Ioannidis of Stanford, who is, perhaps the biggest statistical guru, alive today in terms of how to interpret data, basically says we should stop all nutrition research because it's all bullshit. Now, I think that's a little severe, personally.
Although you are trying to kill the word nutrition.
I'm trying to kill the word calorie.
Okay. I thought it was nutrition as well.
No, I'm not trying to kill the word nutrition. I'm trying to put it in its proper place.
Got it.
So actually, let's go there for a minute. I think we've beaten calcium and milk to it, to smithereens here. Let's go there for a minute. There are three words, and they get equated frequently. Three terms, and they're not the same. Those three terms are food science, nutrition, and metabolic health. Now, what is the difference between those three terms?
I know because I've heard you talk about this.
Okay, well, for your audience, food science is what happens to food between the ground and the mouth. Nutrition is what happens to food between the mouth and the cell. Metabolic health is what happens to food inside the cell. So they're all related, but clearly they're not the same. Metabolic health is the only one we really care about. It's metabolic health that drives what we should be doing. Because if something is not metabolically healthy, we shouldn't be doing it, because it means it's killing us. Okay? And in fact, the World Economic Forum appropriately put out a white paper this year, which, by the way, I had something to do with, called The True Purpose of Nutrition. And it turns out the true purpose of nutrition is metabolic health. Now, nutrition can only inform metabolic health. It is not the same as metabolic health. It can inform it, but it's one step divorced from it, because it's only what's in the blood, not what's in the cell. Food science is two steps divorced from metabolic health. And unfortunately, that's the only thing that the food industry is telling you. So ultimately, the science of what goes on inside the cell is what matters. Metabolic health is the true purpose of nutrition. It's the only reason to study nutrition is metabolic health. Well, we have ignored that for 50 years in favor of this thing called nutrition. So it's not that nutrition is useless. It's that it's an adjunct to understanding metabolic health. It's an adjunct to figuring out what gets presented to the cell, so then we can determine what goes on inside the cell. So I'm not saying get rid of nutrition. I'm saying de-emphasize it.
It's not the whole picture.
It's not even remotely close to the whole picture.
You mentioned wanting to leave milk, but you did bring something up there that has a couple little nuances I want to tease out before we fully part ways with it. And that's the calcium supplements. And you mentioned them not being effective. Have you heard of them clogging up the blood vessels? I know there was some people talking about that. I don't know how much hard science there was behind it. But for people out there that are taking those, we're learning that they're not effective. But the way I understand it, they can actually be detrimental.
In certain patients, if they don't clear the calcium well, yeah, they could. Now, some people need them. I have to take a calcium supplement at night myself because I get leg spasms in the middle of the night unless I take calcium. And I have been checked for hypoparathyroidism or some metabolic problem, and I don't seem to have one. And when I take a calcium supplement, the leg spasms go away. So I'm treating them symptomatically, and I don't know why I have these, but, I do. And what's interesting is my mother had them. So is it genetic? Is it we eat the same crap? Is it something else? I don't know. I've talked to endocrinologists about it. I don't know if the calcium works. Good. But yes, I have heard that as well, and it depends on how well it's cleared.
Okay. And the other piece that ties into that, the way I understand K2 is it helps the calcium go to where it needs to be in the body and deposit in the right areas.
I'm not aware of that, and you could teach me there. I know about K2, but I've not heard that.
Okay. All right, before we pull out of fats, we're going to zoom back out of milk now and calcium. A couple more little nuances there in that part of the conversation I want to make sure we address. One being the first piece you started with was talking about EPA and DHA and the importance of those. Another one of the 7 was polyunsaturated fats. And the way I understand polyunsaturated, the EPA and DHA fall under that category. Is that true?
No, EPA and DHA are omega-3s.
I thought omega-3s followed under the polyunsaturated.
Well, they are, but they're a very specific kind of polyunsaturated. We keep them separate.
Got it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to tease that nuance out. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, omega-9s are polyunsaturates. We don't consider omega-3s the same as omega-9s.
And the last piece within fats then before we leave is for somebody that isn't vegan, you mentioned the fact that that can be problematic when it comes to because they're not going to directly be getting any EPA and DHA. They need to convert or they got to go back to the algae source and get that from that.
Well,
but
the conversion is pretty low. It's like less than 1.5%.
Exactly. So, but they can go all the way back to taking an algae oil, the way I understand it, and then get the DHA and EPA that way.
No, not quite.
Okay.
Almost right. But let me correct that, Jesse. Algal oil. Okay. I know a lot about algal oil. Okay. We have researched it in part for this big study we did in Kuwait, which I'm sure we will get to. Algal oil is DHA. Algal oil is DHA. And DHA is important for neuronal structure. No question, no argument. So if you're not getting your DHA from anywhere, then algal oil is a way to get DHA. But algal oil is not a source of EPA. Now, EPA is necessary for neurotransmission. The EPA is the thing that makes fish oil smell like fish. DHA is pretty clean. So it's easy to add DHA to stuff. It's easy to add algal oil to stuff. But EPA is another story because EPA carries that fishy smell along with it. So if you are grinding up salmon livers to get EPA and DHA, you'll get both. Okay, but if you're going to just take the algae and basically develop this clean, colorless, tasteless, odorless algal oil that you basically can add to food, they've had to remove the EPA for that reason. So, in fact, algal oil provides an important source of DHA, but it is not a significant source of EPA for that reason. So that remains a problem.
I didn't realize that. Important information here, because I think a lot of people that are on a plant-based diet or vegan diet assume that if they're taking that supplement, the algal oil, that they're getting everything that somebody would get from a fish oil.
You can get your ALA from your vegetables. You can get your DHA from algal oil, but you're still going to be EPA deficient.
And now that we're on that vegan topic and we know there's this hole within the diet and supplementing, any other concerns for somebody on that diet? Things that they're not getting or things that they're getting too much of that are causing problems? And let's relate it to the mitochondria and metabolic health if we can. Use that as our common thread today.
Sure. Not so much the metabolic health. I mean, I think mitochondrial health is probably reasonable otherwise, but, obviously you need those omega-3s to make those mitochondria, function at peak efficiency. But there are two things that are low in a vegan diet that are an issue, and they're two amino acids, tryptophan and methionine. So tryptophan is the rarest amino acid, and methionine is the second rarest amino acid. And for the most part, vegetable protein is relatively low in both tryptophan and methionine. And you need both. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, and serotonin is the contentment, happiness neurotransmitter, does a lot of things. And your gut bacteria make serotonin, but they need tryptophan in order to do it. And if they don't have the tryptophan to do it, then you get all sorts of issues in your gut, including gut inflammation and also the lack of carriage of serotonin up the afferent vagus nerve to the brain. And so tryptophan depletion is associated with irritability and depression. And also methionine. And methionine is a primary source of methyl groups. And you need methyl groups because you have to methylate proteins. It's essential. And also because there's sulfur. And so methionine, both methyl and also sulfur. And you need the sulfur as a reducing agent, an antioxidant, in order to prevent oxidation. And so methionine is a primary contributor to S-adenosine methionine, which is necessary to create glutathione. And glutathione is the liver's endogenous antioxidant. So if you're methionine deficient, you're going to be glutathione deficient, in which case your liver is going to have decreased oxidative capacity, which is not good because that's a great way to damage your liver too.
For somebody that's consuming some meat in their diet, is the tryptophan and methionine ever an issue for them, or do they typically get enough?
No, they get plenty.
Okay.
They get plenty.
And then what about the omega-3 piece?
The best place, by the way, for tryptophan and methionine is fish. You know, if I could wave a magic wand, I would basically provide every vegan in the country with the knowledge that if they just ate a little bit of fish to go along with their veganism, they could solve all their nutritional problems.
Which brings me to my next point. Can we get enough omega-3s from fish as somebody who is eating meat? Because that, fish oil is a really popular supplement. It's something I'm currently taking. Can we get enough from food alone?
Well, yes, you can, but you can't get enough from vegan food alone.
No. But the average person that's eating, a mixed diet and having fish periodically, do you feel like, because we've stressed the importance of those omega-3s, do you feel that they're important enough that we should supplement on top of a healthy diet, or we can get enough from the diet alone?
Well, it depends. When you say eating a little bit of fish, what does that mean?
Oh, of course.
Are we talking once a week?
Well, let's talk about what we would need to do.
If you ate fish twice a week, you'd have more than enough. If you eat fish once a week, kind of depends on where you go for your fish. Because if it's farmed fish, no. If it's wild fish, probably yes.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Ultimately, it's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food that matters. Everything fructose does to the mitochondria is designed to inhibit its functioning. It's metabolic health that drives